Welcome to the sleep paralysis tapes. Settle into the dark, pull the covers close, and let the heavy silence fill your room. Tonight, we descend into chilling tales of the unexplained. Before the screen fades to pitch black, I invite you to become part of this archive. If you have your own terrifying encounters, please contact me and I will narrate your story in a future tape. If these shadows bring you comfort, please like, subscribe, and tap the bell. Now, close your eyes. Do not look at the foot of your bed. Just listen and let us begin. It was late August. It was quiet. And in the basement of Daiche Hall at the University of Kansas, a woman named Sarah Chen was about to find something impossible. Now, you need to understand something about fossil preparation. It's not adventure. It's not glamour. It's a form of meditation. You sit in a room that smells of old stone and glue under the flat white buzz of fluorescent lights. You remove rock from bone, one grain of sand at a time. For hours. For days. It's a slow, patient conversation with deep time. For Sarah, that was the appeal. The world outside was loud and chaotic. But in Prep Lab 23B, with its concrete walls, the rules were simple. You follow the bone. You respect the surrounding rock. You document everything. The fossil was a hadrosaur femur, a duck-billed dinosaur's thigh bone, still encased in a hefty nodule of sandstone from the Hell Creek Formation. 70 million years old, it had arrived that morning, a heavy, anonymous lump on a padded cart. To anyone else, it would have looked like a chunk of sidewalk. To Sarah, it was a promise. A thesis project, a story waiting to be told. She set up her station on one of the long steel tables. She positioned the lamp, the circle of white light falling onto the gray-brown rock. She laid out her tools, an array of dental picks, their tips gleaming. Soft, bristled brushes, a small vacuum, and the dino light, a digital microscope on a gooseneck arm. It connects to a monitor, letting you see the rock magnified 50 or 100 times. It turns a speck of dust into a landscape. She pulled on her lab coat, tied her dark hair back, and adjusted her magnifying visor. The first step was always documentation. She powered on the dino light. The monitor flickered to life, showing a blur of gray. She focused on an unremarkable patch of the sandstone, away from where the bone was suspected to be. This was her before shot. The sandstone was fine-grained, a compacted desert floor from a world before grass or flowers. Sarah picked up her smallest pick, a tool no thicker than a needle. She found a natural fissure in the rock, a hairline crack. She inserted the tip gently. She applied the faintest pressure. A tiny flake of sandstone, smaller than a grain of salt, popped free. She brushed it away, then caught the dust with the vacuum. Click. She took another digital image. This was the rhythm. Pick, brush, vacuum, click. The only sounds were the hum of the lights, the soft scratch of metal on stone, and the occasional whisper of the vacuum. Her world shrank to the circle of light, the feel of the tool in her fingers. This is where she was happiest. Suspended in the work, the past million years felt not so much like history, but like a distance you could cross, grain by careful grain. She worked for 2 hours. The nodule began to reveal its topography under the lens, tiny ripples from an ancient stream, a darker streak of mineral. It was all normal. It was all exactly as it should be. Then she moved to a new section, a flat, seemingly blank area of the rock, about 6 inches from where the femur's curve was starting to become visible. She leaned in, her eye to the visor, and guided the pick to a tiny bump. She intended to just level it off. The pick slipped. Not much, just a skid. It carved a shallow, unintended groove. Sarah frowned. She hated being careless. She switched to a brush to clear the dust from her mistake. As the dust cleared under the gentle sweep of the brush, the dino light captured it. And on the monitor, magnified 100 times, Sarah saw it. It wasn't a mineral stain. It wasn't a crack. It wasn't a fossilized leaf. It was a fingerprint. The ridge detail was pristine. A clear, central pocket whorl pattern, the kind you leave on a glass. It was pressed into the 70-million-year-old sandstone as if the rock had been wet clay yesterday. Sarah sat back. She blinked. She took off her visor, rubbed her eyes, and looked at the actual fossil right in front of her. The nodule was solid, dry, ancient stone. She looked back at the monitor. The fingerprint was still there, sharp and modern. A mistake, she thought immediately. It had to be. Someone in the field, maybe. A collector, a handler, a print left in some kind of coating. That was the logical answer. The only answer. So she did what any good scientist would do. She dismissed the anomaly. She moved her light. She shifted the dino light to a different spot a few centimeters away. She focused. She cleared the dust. And there was another one. And another. A cluster of 3 perfect human fingerprints fossilized inside the rock. The quiet of the lab changed then. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. The hum of the lights felt like a held breath. Sarah Chen stared at the impossible, and the comfortable, dusty meditation of deep time cracked right down the middle. This is where it starts. Not with a scream, not with a monster, with a quiet, meticulous woman in a basement lab, looking at something that simply cannot be, and deciding against every instinct to look a little closer. Sarah sat there for a long time, not moving, just listening to the hum of the lights. The logical part of her brain, the part that had gotten her into this lab, was throwing up a wall of explanations. It was a trick of the light, a flaw in the digital sensor, a prank. Someone had pressed a fake fingerprint into some fresh plaster and glued it to the rock as a joke. It had to be that. But the rest of her, the part that lived in her hands and her eyes as she worked, knew better. She leaned forward again. Her movements were precise now, almost mechanical. She didn't pick up the tool. She adjusted the Dino Light digital microscope instead. She zoomed in. The whorls filled her view. She could make out the individual sweat pores along the ridges, tiny dark dots in the gray stone. A central pocket well, perfect clarity. She took a photograph. The camera shutter sound was absurdly loud in the quiet. She moved the scope a millimeter. Another print, a loop pattern, overlapping the first. A third, a partial, just the arch of a fingertip. She documented them all. Dozens of high-resolution images from every angle. The evidence was piling up, digital and undeniable, right there on her hard drive, and with every click, the quiet in the room got heavier, more personal. A reasonable person would have stopped here. They would have backed away, called someone, let the authorities handle it. But Sarah, she was a preparator. Her job was to reveal truth, grain by grain. She had just found a truth that made no sense, and she couldn't let it go. She waited until the end of her shift. She printed the clearest images on glossy photo paper. Then she went upstairs to her supervisor's office. Dr. Armitage was an older man, the kind who'd seen everything twice. He looked at the photographs Sarah placed on his desk. He put on his reading glasses. He studied them for a full minute, saying nothing. Sarah stood there, her hands clasped tight behind her back. Finally, he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Contamination," he said. His voice was flat. "Final. Sir, the ridge detail is in the matrix. It's not on the surface. It's fossilized. It's a modern impression in some kind of filler or repair compound," Armitage said, not looking at her. "Happens more than you think. Field jackets get cracked. People use quickset plaster or epoxy to stabilize them before shipping. Someone with dirty, muddy hands patched a hole. That print set in the patch material, which then hardened and was mistaken for the original matrix. It's careless, but it's not impossible." He slid the photos back toward her. "Log it as an anomaly. Note the potential for modern contamination. Then continue with the standard preparation protocol. Avoid that section of the matrix. Sarah opened her mouth to argue. The rock showed no signs of repair. The sandstone was continuous, unbroken. The patch would have to be a perfect, invisible match in grain, color, and density. It was more impossible than the fingerprint, but she saw his face. The shut door. The conversation was over. She took the photos and walked back downstairs. The basement hallway felt colder. The dismissal should have been a relief. It gave her a box to put the nightmare in, a label to stick on it. Contamination. Case closed. But it wasn't closed. Not for her. Because she had seen the sweat pores. So she made a decision. If they were going to call it contamination, she would need proof that couldn't be deleted, or filed away, or explained away. She needed something you could hold in your hand. After everyone had left, she went back to the lab. She took out a small kit from her locker. It contained a tube of silicone impression material, the kind dentists use. 3M Express, fast setting, high detail. Her heart was hammering now. This was against protocol. Making a physical cast without authorization was a serious breach. But she had to know. She mixed the toothpaste together, her hands steady despite everything. She carefully applied the pale, putty-like gel directly onto the cluster of prints in the rock. She pressed it gently, making sure it flowed into every microscopic ridge and valley. She held it there, counting the seconds as it set. The lab was utterly silent. She felt, for the first time, truly alone down there, as if the building above her had vanished. After a few minutes, she peeled the silicone away. And there it was, lifted from the stone, a perfect negative impression of the fingerprints. A ghost in rubber. She could run her own finger over the ridges and valleys. It was real. It was tangible. She had captured the impossible in her palm. She made 2 more casts. Then she cleaned the rock meticulously, leaving no trace of the silicone. The final step was the security check. She logged into the museum system. She pulled up the access logs for Lab 23B for the past week. Only her ID and the IDs of the 2 collections managers who brought the cart. She checked the hallway camera footage, the single camera that pointed at the lab's heavy door. She fast-forwarded through the last 48 hours. Nothing. No one came or went except the authorized personnel. No shadowy figures with clay-stained hands. No one at all. She sat back in her chair. The casts were in a small box next to her keyboard. The digital photos were on her screen. The logs were clean. She had followed the evidence. She had done everything right. And all it had done was strip away every logical, comfortable explanation Dr. Armitage had offered. The prints were in the rock. No one had put them there, and they didn't match anyone who had ever touched it. She was left with just the facts. And the facts were wrong. This is the point, you see, where denial stops working, when the world doesn't bend back into shape. Sarah packed her bag. She placed the box with the silicone casts inside. She turned off the lights. And as she walked out of Disha Hall into the warm August night, she carried the proof with her. It weighed almost nothing, but it changed everything, because now the anomaly wasn't just on a screen in a basement, it was in her pocket. The silence after that, it's a different kind of quiet. It's not peaceful. It's waiting. Sarah had the proof in her pocket, but proof of what? A prank? A mistake? Or something that would unravel the quiet order of her world? She tried to go about her week. She prepped other fossils. She wrote her notes. But the hadrosaur femur sat on its cart in the corner of room 23B under a cloth. It was like a patient waiting for a diagnosis no doctor wanted to give. Every time she walked past it, the air felt thicker, colder. And whispers. In a place like that, they have a way of moving. Through the ventilation shafts. Through the dust. From one lab coat to another at the coffee machine, they reached a man named Henry Doyle. Everyone called him Hank. He'd retired a decade ago after 32 years as a senior preparator. He was old museum. The kind of man who knew where every bone in the collection was, and probably the story of how it got there. He heard the words "prints in the rock" from a former colleague, and he knew. He found Sarah's university email. His message was simple. "Heard about your find. By an old man. A coffee?" They met at a place a few blocks from campus. It was all bright windows and the smell of roasted beans. A normal place. That's where the worst stories are always told. Hank was in his 70s, with careful hands and eyes that had seen a lot of stone. He stirred his black coffee, not looking at her at first. He said, "Armitage told you it was contamination." It wasn't a question. Sarah just nodded. "He would," Hank said, almost to himself. "He's a good man." He has to be. His job is to keep the lights on and the grants coming. Anomalies are bad for business. He took a sip. Then he set his cup down, perfectly centered on its saucer. The click was very final. "There was a story," he began. "Old when I was young, late 50s maybe. Told to me by a guy who'd heard it from the guy who was there. You know how it goes." He leaned forward, his voice dropping, even in the empty cafe. Back then, the night security was just one guy, an older fellow. He did his rounds with a big metal flashlight. The basement hall was in Dish Hall, long, and the lights were dimmer then. He'd make his pass, check the locks, and move on. Hank's eyes were on the table, but he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing that hallway. One night, on his 2 a.m. round, he comes up to the prep lab door, the big window in the door, and he sees a light on inside, a single lamp over one of the tables. And there's a man standing there, in a lab coat, working on a fossil. Sarah felt her breath catch. She hadn't told anyone about staying late, about the feeling of being alone down there. "The guard," Hank continued. "He's confused. No one is scheduled. He's about to go in, ask for credentials, but something stops him. He just watches. The man is using tools, delicate tools. Like he knows what he's doing. He's focused. He never looks up." Hank's finger traced a pattern on the table, a whorl. The guard said the fossil the man was working on, it wasn't one he recognized. It was dark, looked like a leg bone still in the rock. And the man's hands. He paused. This was the part he'd carried for 50 years. The guard said the man's hands were stained, a deep reddish color, like he'd been kneading wet clay. Up to his wrists. It was vivid under the lamp. He said it looked fresh. Sarah's own hands, resting on her knees, felt suddenly cold. The guard finally pushes the door open. He calls out, "Hey, you're not supposed to be in here." Hank's voice was a soft, gruff imitation. The man at the table. He stops. He doesn't turn around. He just stops moving. Complete stillness. The guard takes a step forward, says it again. And then, the light over the table just goes out, not the bulb blowing. A clean, silent off. He took another sip of coffee. His hand was perfectly steady. The guard fumbles for his flashlight. He flicks it on. He sweeps the beam across the lab. It's empty. The fossil was gone from the table. The tools were gone. The man in the lab coat was gone. The only door was the one the guard was standing in. And on the stainless steel table under the beam of his flashlight, Sarah knew. She knew before he said it, a single, perfect thumbprint. In reddish-gray clay, still damp. The cafe noise around them seemed to fade into a distant hum. They filed a report, of course, Hank said, sitting back. The night guard was a reliable guy. But what was there to do? No one was missing. Nothing was stolen. They called it an overactive imagination. Stress. Maybe he'd fallen asleep on his rounds. The story became a ghost story, a piece of museum trivia to tell new grad students over a beer. He looked at Sarah, then really looked at her. His eyes were kind but deeply, permanently tired. I never forgot it. Not because it was scary, but because of the way the old-timers talked about it when they thought no one was listening. They didn't laugh. They'd get quiet. One of them, a guy named Leo, he said something once. He said, "Something's in the ground." They don't all come out as bones. I didn't know what he meant then. I think I do now. He pushed his empty cup away. "You found prints in the rock," he said. "Not on it. In it. And now you've heard a story about a man with clay on his hands putting a print on a table. One is 70 million years old. One was wet yesterday. They're not the same story." He leaned in close, his voice a dry whisper. "They're the same thing. It's not an anomaly, Sarah. It's a pattern. And a pattern means it happens more than once." He stood up, placing a few dollars on the table. He gave her a small, sad smile. "Armitage will tell you to forget it. And you should try. For your sake, you should really try." And he walked out, leaving Sarah alone with her cooling coffee and a dread that had just found roots in the past. Because that's how it gets you. A single strange thing is a mistake. A coincidence. But two strange things, separated by decades, that's the beginning of a shape. And once you see the shape, you can't stop seeing it. Every shadow in the hallway starts to look like a man in a lab coat. Every stain on your own skin looks like it might not wash off. Sarah left the cafe. She walked back to Wooddyche Hall. The afternoon sun was bright. Students were laughing on the lawn. The world was normal. But she was carrying the shape now. And the shape had clay-stained hands. It was waiting in the basement. And it had left its mark, not just in stone, but in time. And she knew, with a cold certainty, that she would have to see it for herself. The silence of a museum after hours isn't like other silences. It's not empty. It's full of held breath, of things that have stopped moving but haven't stopped being. Sarah knew this as she waited in the dark. She'd stayed behind. When the final footsteps echoed up the stairwell, she didn't leave. She moved to Dr. Armitage's office. It had a small window looking into the prep lab. She left the office lights off. She pulled a chair into the shadows by the door, and she waited. The only light was the faint green glow of an emergency exit sign down the hall. This was a vigil. A vigil is a form of prayer. You're not asking for something to happen. You're asking for something not to happen. Please, let nothing be there. Please, let me have been wrong. The building's systems hummed around her. The low thrum of a distant furnace, the occasional click of a thermostat, every 30 minutes, a soft whir as the security cameras in the hallway moved on their mounts. She watched the prep lab door through the window. It was just a darker rectangle in the dark. Beyond it, she knew the hadrosaur femur sat on its cart, a quiet lump of deep time. Hour 1. Her legs cramped. Hour 2. Her eyes played tricks. Hour 3. The deep night dread set in. That hollow feeling that comes after midnight when the world feels thin, when every story you've ever heard about things that walk in the dark starts to feel possible. This is the worst part. The waiting. Your mind becomes a trap. Every creak of the building settling is a footstep. Every shift of the air from the vent is a sigh. You start to doubt your own reasons for being there. You feel foolish. Then you feel terrified. Then you feel foolish for being terrified. It's a loop. And it tightens with every minute. She checked her phone. 3:10 a.m. The dead center of the night. Her eyes were dry and heavy. She almost missed it at 3:14 a.m. Exactly, the motion-activated lights in the fossil prep lab snapped on. There was no buzz, no flicker. 1 second, the room was a pool of darkness. The next, it was flooded with the flat white glare of the fluorescence. Sarah's heart didn't hammer. It stopped. It just froze in her chest. She was pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She stared into the brightly lit, utterly empty lab. Nothing had moved. The door hadn't opened, but the lights were on. The sensors had been tripped. She watched. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. Just an empty, silent room suddenly illuminated for no one. This is the moment where you have a choice. You can stay in the dark office. You can rationalize. A power surge. A faulty timer. A mouse. You can wrap yourself in the blanket of the possible and wait for morning. Sarah stood up. Her body felt cold and distant. She walked to the office door. She opened it. The hallway air was cooler. She stepped out. The door to the prep lab was just a door. She stared at the handle. If you've ever moved toward a thing you know is wrong, you know this feeling. It's not courage. It's the opposite. It's a total surrender to the need to know, even if knowing is the worst thing that can happen to you. She pushed the door open. The light was blinding after the dark hallway. The hum was louder in here. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The tools neatly arranged, the cart with its draped fossil in the corner. Silence. Emptiness. Just a room. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. A shaky half-laugh of relief. It was a glitch. A stupid, terrifying glitch. She walked toward her workstation, maybe to just touch something normal. And that's when she saw it. On the stainless steel table, right in the center of the clean surface, was a single thumbprint. It was in a reddish-gray clay. Potter's clay. It was wet. It gleamed under the harsh lights. She didn't touch it. She just stared. Her mind went utterly blank. The print was fresh. Damn, it hadn't been there. The motion sensors had turned the lights on. The room was empty. And now this was here. Her eyes traced the whorl pattern. It was clear, defined. A different pattern from the ones in the rock. Then, a drop of moisture gathered at the edge of the print. It trembled for a second, and then it fell, leaving a tiny dark spot on the steel. That was the sound. In all that silence, the soft, almost inaudible pat of that single drop of water hitting the table. It was the loudest thing Sarah had ever heard. She backed away. One step, then another. Her eyes never left the print. It was a violation, a message, a proof that didn't prove anything, except that the rules were broken. She backed out of the lab. She hit the light switch, plunging the room back into darkness. But she could still see it burned onto her vision. That wet red thumbprint. She didn't run. She walked slowly down the long hallway. She gathered her bag. She left the museum as the first gray light of dawn touched the windows. The world outside was quiet and still and normal. But she knew, now she knew for sure, something had been in that room with her. Something that left a mark. Something that walked in the dark and didn't care if the lights were on. And it had touched her world. Not through stone this time, but directly, leaving a wet red stain that said as clearly as any words, "I am here." The morning after is always the worst part. The world comes back, the sun comes up, and you're left holding something that doesn't fit into it. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in her apartment, the blinds drawn, staring at the wall. At her own hands. They were clean. There was no clay. The memory of that wet print on the steel table felt like a burn. A brand. By the time she walked back to Deitch Hall, the rational world had already begun its work. It had a name for what she'd done. They called it breaking and entering. They called it unauthorized after-hours activity. They called it contamination of a research specimen. She went straight to Dr. Armitage. She didn't try to explain the lights. She didn't mention the vigil. She just showed him the photograph on her phone, the one she'd taken of the fresh, wet thumbprint on the table. He looked at it for a long time. His face didn't change. He just absorbed it. Then he picked up his phone and made 2 calls, one to campus security, one to the head of the department. You need to understand something about institutions. They are not built for the impossible. They are built for order, for process. When something threatens that order, the response is not investigation, it is containment. The official investigation lasted 3 days. It was thorough. And it found nothing. Security reviewed the hallway camera footage. It showed Sarah entering the office wing at 5:42 p.m. It showed her heat signature, a lone white bloom, sitting in the dark office for hours. It showed her leaving at 4:07 a.m. At no point did the camera see anyone else enter or leave the prep lab corridor. At 3:14 a.m., the timestamp on the footage showed a sudden bloom of light from under the prep lab door. Nothing else. Forensics took the clay sample. They analyzed it. It was standard, low fire potter's clay, reddish, gray. It contained no human DNA, no skin cells, no unique particulates or fibers to trace. It was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost, a print left by nothing. They interviewed Sarah twice. They were polite and professional. They asked why she was in the building after hours. They asked if she had any personal clay or pottery materials. They asked if she was under any stress. They listened to her story about the fossilized prints, about Hank Doyle's tale. They took notes. Their faces were blank sheets of paper. And then they closed the file. The official finding was a masterpiece of bureaucratic language. Unresolved contamination event. It acknowledged something happened. It refused to say what. It placed the origin of the clay print as indeterminate. It cited the lack of forensic evidence and the clean security feed. It recommended that the fossil specimen in question be isolated for, quote, long-term archival stability review. That's the phrase they used. Archival stability. It sounds so calm, so final. They took the hadrosaur femur. They took the silicone cast Sarah had made. They took every digital image from the dino light microscope. They took her lab notes. They even took the incident report she'd filed about the original find. All of it was placed in a sterile, climate-controlled archive box. The box was sealed with a tamper-evident band. It was given an accession number, and it was wheeled into a secure, windowless vault in the museum's collections area. The room was kept at a constant 68 degrees with 45% humidity, a perfect environment for preserving a mystery. Sarah was not disciplined. She was managed. She was allowed to finish her master's degree. But her thesis committee, gently and firmly, steered her away from the Hell Creek hadrosaurs. Her new topic was on taphonomic processes in marine reptile deposits. It was safe. It was miles away from sandstone matrices and impossible fingerprints. She completed her degree and graduated. On the surface, it was a success. But something in her had fractured. Not a breakdown. Not a madness. A quieter, more fundamental thing. She had always believed that the world was a puzzle with all its pieces, that if you were careful and meticulous, you could fit them together and see the true picture. She had found a piece that didn't belong, a piece from a different puzzle altogether. And when she tried to show it to the other puzzle solvers, they took the piece, locked it in a dark box, and told her to keep working on the edges of the picture. She got a job at a different museum, smaller one. She works with fossils. She is good at her job. But she never uses a dino light microscope now. She prefers old-fashioned magnifying lenses, the kind that don't connect to a screen, the kind that only show you what's right in front of your eye. There's no chance of digital artifacts, no chance of seeing something in a resolution so clear it becomes impossible. She avoids the basement labs at night, and sometimes, when she's working on a particularly stubborn piece of matrix, she'll stop. She'll put her tools down, and she'll just look at her own thumb pressed against the cool steel of the table. She'll look at the whorls and ridges unique to her, formed before she was born, a record of her own existence pressed onto the world. And she'll think about a record pressed into stone 70 million years before she existed. And she'll think about a record left on a steel table in the middle of a night by something that didn't leave any other trace. The question isn't, what was it anymore? She's given up on that. The question that stays with her, the one that altered her path, is much simpler and much worse. It's how many times? How many other preparators and how many other basements under how many other fluorescent lights have found something wrong in the stone? How many have seen a shadow that didn't belong? How many have had their neat, logical world quietly cracked by a piece of evidence that shouldn't exist? And how many of those stories are locked in archive boxes, or dismissed over coffee, or carried quietly to the grave by old men like Hank Doyle? The fossil is still there. In the vault. In the dark. The casts are there. The photos. The report. All of it. Perfectly preserved. Waiting. For what? Sarah doesn't know. And that's the thing she lives with now. Not fear, exactly, not dread. A deep, cold understanding that the past is not a sealed room. That the door to deep time isn't just one way. And that sometimes something on the other side leaves a fingerprint. And the only thing more terrifying than finding it is knowing that someone, someday, will open that archive box again. They'll pull out the silicone cast. They'll feel the ridges under their own finger. They'll look at the photograph of the wet clay print on the steel table. And they'll decide, against every instinct, to look a little closer. The story doesn't end here. It just goes quiet, the way a museum goes quiet after hours, full of held breath and waiting. And the tape has reached its end. I hope the stories tonight brought a pleasant chill to your spine as you drifted further into the dark. Thank you for braving the shadows here at the Sleep Paralysis tapes. If you are still awake, lying still in the quiet, remember to contact me with your own unsettling encounters so they can be added to our growing archive. As my voice fades away, let the silence of your room wrap around you completely. May your sleep be undisturbed, your doors remain locked, and your morning arrive safely. Until we open the tapes again, good night.